Hey guys, tonight we drift high above the roof of the world, the Tibetan plateau, a land so vast and silent that the very air feels thinner, the horizon stretched wider, and the stars at night shine more fiercely than anywhere else you've ever seen. You imagine yourself standing here, the chill wind brushing your cheeks, snow peaks glowing with silver light, and a sense that you're at the edge of the earth itself. So take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're comfortable, drop a comment with your location and the local time you're listening. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide this journey travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The plateau beneath your feet is not empty, though at first it feels that way. The silence is deceptive. Rivers carve their way through the rocky ground, gleaming ribbons of life winding across the plains. Nomads lead herds of yak and sheep, their tents clustered like little dots of black against the white backdrop. Each step you take feels slow, almost dreamlike, but you sense that these winds carry with them the beginnings of a story that will swell into something enormous, an empire stretching across Asia, yet born here in this seemingly desolate land. As you walk, you hear the crunch of stone under your boots, and in your mind's eye, time folds back on itself. You picture the earliest communities here, clans moving with the seasons, guided by stars and the grazing of animals. The Tibetans of old were hardy, living on barley flour mixed with butter tea, the salty aroma rising from steaming cups that warmed their hands in the frigid air. You can almost taste it yourself, rich, oily, a comfort against the thin wind. This was a land where survival was already a triumph, and to dream of power and conquest seemed nearly impossible. Yet those dreams did take root. One mainstream historical fact often noted is that the Tibetan plateau, averaging over 4,000 meters above sea level, is the highest inhabited region on Earth. Life here demanded adaptation, lungs growing stronger, hearts pounding faster, bodies learning to thrive where oxygen thinned. You feel that strain yourself, as if each breath you take requires intention. It's no wonder that Tibetans developed not just physical resilience, but spiritual practices centered on breathing, meditation, and endurance. And as you walk, your senses soften, and you glimpse something curious from long ago. Ancient tales of mountain gods who roamed the peaks, fierce spirits said to shape the weather with a glance, hurling snowstorms or sunlight at whim. Nomads whispered of these beings as they crossed passes, and sometimes they would stop to leave offerings, a sprinkle of flour, a lock of hair to appease the unseen forces above. You stoop and run your hand over a cairn of stones, imagining the prayers murmured into the cold air, prayers carried away by wind that never rests. Historians still argue whether the earliest Tibetan clans were fully unified by bloodline, or if they were bound more loosely by alliances, each tribe shifting loyalties with the seasons. Perhaps it was never one clear picture at all, but a mosaic of groups who gradually began to think of themselves as part of something larger. That uncertainty hangs in the air as you look out across the empty vastness where any single tent feels swallowed by distance, and you wonder how unity could have emerged at all. Night deepens around you. The Milky Way arches like a frozen river of light, and you find yourself listening for sounds beyond the wind, the muffled thud of drums perhaps, or the chant of shamans beneath the sky. These were people attuned to rhythm, to ritual. Fire crackled in the dark, shadows danced across hides stretched for shelter, and stories were told of ancestors who came down from the heavens carrying wisdom in their blood. Whether myth or memory, these tales were the seeds of identity, a way for scattered groups to imagine themselves as one. You continue on, feeling the ground slope gently upward toward a ridge. Each step feels heavier, but your mind drifts lighter, carried by the thought of what is about to unfold. Empires do not spring from nothing. They grow from soil, from water, from hardship, and from imagination. Here on this cold plateau, all of that exists in abundance. You pause at the crest, and before you lies the sweeping valley of Yarlung, cradled by mountains that rise like guardians. This valley will soon give its name to a dynasty, the Yarlung kings, who claim descent from heavenly figures. Legends say their first ancestor descended on a sky rope, a dazzling cord of light, and ruled with both magic and might. The valley is quiet now, just the rustle of grass and the distant bark of a dog, but you can already feel the pulse of destiny gathering here, waiting for the moment when one man will seize it and begin to shape a kingdom. Your eyes close for a moment, breathing deeply of the thin, sharp air, and you sense both fragility and strength in this land. The empire has not yet risen, but the soil is ready, the people hardened, the spirits restless. And as the night sky shivers with stars above you, you know that tomorrow, or 100 tomorrows from now, a new dawn will break. A dawn of banners, of battles, of gods and kings. You stir again in the cold morning light, the plateau pale beneath the rising sun, and the Yarlung Valley lies quiet before you. But in your mind, the silence breaks with the sound of hoofbeats, the murmur of clans gathering, the growing stir of ambition that will give rise to Songtsen Gampo, the man who will be remembered as the true founder of the Tibetan Empire. His name drifts through the thin air, half legend, half history, yet as you picture him, the story begins to sharpen. Songtsen Gampo is said to have been born at the turn of the 7th century, the heir of Namri Songtsen, a Yarlung king who began to unite the valleys under one banner. You imagine the boy growing in strength, watching from the mountain slopes as envoys came and went, as tribal leaders bent the knee or resisted with clenched fists. He learned early that survival on the plateau required not only bravery, but cunning. When Namri Songtsen died, perhaps poisoned, perhaps felled by rivals, the young Songtsen Gampo rose to power, inheriting not a peaceful land, but one trembling with uncertainty. You walk through a vision of his early reign, banners snapping in the wind horns, echoing across the ridges, soldiers gathered in ranks. Songtsen Gampo is more than just another chieftain. He is determined to weld the fractious tribes into something larger, something enduring. And you can almost hear him addressing his warriors, his voice low but commanding, promising that together they will not just survive, but rule. The mainstream historical fact that gives shape to his reign is clear. Around 618 CE, Songtsen Gampo established the Yarlung dynasty's dominance, laying the foundations of the Tibetan Empire. His campaigns spread beyond the valley, subduing rivals and extending his reach until the plateau that once seemed divided was now bound beneath his authority. Still you lean closer to the whispers of legend. Some accounts claim that Songtsen Gampo had a body said to radiate light, a sign of his semi-divine heritage. Others suggest he possessed the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes, making judgments with uncanny foresight. Perhaps these are exaggerations, perhaps deliberate myth-making, but you can't help but feel a flicker of awe at the way his figure looms through both fact and fable. Historians still argue whether Songtsen Gampo's power came more from sheer military conquest or from careful diplomacy. Was it his army's strength that brought clans into line, or the persuasive marriages and alliances he forged? Some say his brilliance lay in balancing the sword with the scroll, brute force with soft power. You walk in that uncertainty, feeling the weight of both possibilities pressing like the thin air against your lungs. Picture the landscape under his rule. villages tucked into valleys, smoke rising from hearths, fields of barley trembling in the wind. His envoys ride out across the highlands, carrying orders sealed with his authority. Messengers race across mountain passes, their cloaks snapping like wings. Slowly the outline of something greater than scattered tribes begins to emerge, a realm, an empire, fragile but real. You linger on an ancient and curious tidbit. Songtsen Gampo is credited with building 12 castles across Tibet, each said to anchor his power in a different corner of the land. One of them, the Red Fort of Lhasa, would become the nucleus for what centuries later grew into the Potala Palace. Standing there now in your imagination, you see only stone walls rising from the rock, but you know that in time this place will glow with golden roofs and endless chanting. Even now, though it stands as a symbol, Songtsen Gampo reaching beyond the valley, declaring that his rule is not fleeting, but meant to endure. The wind picks up as you descend a slope, and you picture the king's court, bustling with energy. Ministers gather with scrolls in hand maps unfurled across tables, discussions humming late into the night. There is barley beer poured into wooden cups, songs echoing after council ends, but beneath the revelry runs a sharp current of purpose. Songtsen Gampo is not content with what he has. His gaze already turns outward beyond the mountains, toward distant kingdoms and glittering cities. But here in these early days, you feel the rawness of empire's birth. Nothing is certain. Rivals still plot in the shadows, ready to rebel if weakness shows. Every decision feels precarious, like stepping onto ice that may or may not hold. You sense Songtsen Gampo's urgency, his knowledge that unity must be forged quickly and decisively, or the chance will vanish like breath in the cold. And so in this rising dawn of empire, you stand beside him, young, fierce, his mind alight with visions of what Tibet might become. The land is vast, the people many, and their destiny still unwritten. But the first strokes are now on the canvas, bold and unshakable, as Songtsen Gampo begins to rise above the plateau like the sun itself. The wind tugs at your sleeves as you picture Songtsen Gampo, not only as a warrior, but as a diplomat, a man who understands that swords alone cannot bind an empire together. His eyes turn outward toward the glittering civilizations beyond the mountains, toward Nepal to the south and Tang China to the east. You can almost hear the clatter of hooves and the shuffle of silken robes as envoys arrive, their voices low, carrying words of union sealed not by steel, but by marriage. The story of these imperial marriages is both historical fact and shimmering legend. Songtsen Gampo sought brides from foreign lands to secure alliances, strengthening Tibet's place on the stage of Asia. From Nepal came Princess Prakuti, daughter of the Lichavi king. From Tang China, after tense negotiations and more than one clash of arms, came Princess Wencheng. Each woman brought more than a bridal dowry. They carried with them entire worlds of culture, belief, and influence. Imagine the scene as Prakuti arrives from Nepal, her entourage winding through the passes, bright fabrics fluttering like prayer flags, gifts carried on the backs of men and horses. With her comes knowledge of Indian Buddhism, and in her hands sacred statues of the Buddha, golden and serene, destined to be enshrined in Tibetan soil. The people of Lhasa whisper that this foreign queen carries blessings in her very presence, her smile a bridge between lands. From the east, the arrival of Wencheng is more dramatic still. Tang China is powerful, its court dazzling, its emperor proud. To secure a bride from such a place is no small feat. Historians still argue whether Wencheng's marriage was a true gesture of peace or the reluctant result of Tibetan victories on the battlefield that pressured the Tang into compromise. Some sources frame it as friendship, others as submission, and the truth may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is that when Wencheng arrived, she brought with her not only the grace of a princess, but also Buddhist scriptures, celestial charts and techniques in art and architecture that would ripple through Tibetan culture for centuries. You walk through the imagined halls of Songtsen Gampo's court, the two queens seated beside him, their voices soft yet influential. The air smells of incense, resinous and sweet, curling in thin tendrils. Courtiers bow low, offering petitions, while outside the city hums with new energy. Lhasa, once a valley town, begins to swell with monasteries, marketplaces and artisans. The blending of influences is palpable. Indian chants, Chinese patterns, Nepalese artistry, all weaving into the fabric of Tibetan life. One mainstream historical fact is that Songtsen Gampo is traditionally credited with commissioning the Jokang Temple in Lhasa, a sanctuary that even now stands at the heart of Tibetan spiritual life. Both queens are said to have played roles in its creation, each bringing their own sacred images to be enshrined within its walls. Step inside with your imagination. The flicker of butter lamps glows against freshly painted murals. The scent of juniper smoke fills the air, and monks' voices rise in steady chant. This temple is more than a building. It is a promise, a declaration that Tibet's empire will not only conquer with armies, but also nurture a soul. And yet there is an ancient and curious tidbit whispered among storytellers. Some legends say that when Wencheng entered Tibet, she saw the plateau as a wild demoness sprawled across the land, her limbs outstretched, her form restless and dangerous. To subdue her, spirit temples were built at key points of her body, pinning her down like nails driven into earth. The Jokang itself was placed at the heart, where the demoness's chest would be. Whether you believe this tale or not, you feel the shiver of it as you wander the streets of early Lhasa, the sense that buildings themselves were built not only on stone, but on myth. Historians still argue whether Songtsen Gampo's embrace of Buddhism was truly deep or more a political gesture to align Tibet with its powerful neighbors. Some suggest he remained devoted to older practices with Bon rituals, continuing behind closed doors, while others insist he was sincere in his adoption of the Buddhist path. As you drift through the flickering half-light of the temple, you sense the tension faith and politics entwine so tightly that it is impossible to see where one ends and the other begins. You step outside again into the twilight of Lhasa, the mountains glowing red in the last of the sun. Two queens from distant lands now shape the destiny of the plateau, their presence smoothing the edges of conquest with the softer tools of devotion and artistry. Songtsen Gampo, once only a warrior, now stands as something more, a king whose empire stretches not just over land, but into the hearts and beliefs of his people. And as you stand at the edge of the crowd, you know this weaving of alliances, marriages and faith is not the end, but the true beginning of Tibet's transformation. The plateau is no longer isolated. It is a crossroads of Asia, a place where rivers of culture meet, and its empire is set to grow stronger with every breath of the thin, cold wind. You drift through the valley as the sounds of construction echo faintly in the thin air, hammers striking stone voices chanting prayers, scribes bending over new symbols scratched onto parchment. For all the alliances Songtsen Gampo has forged, for all the battles won and temples raised, his most enduring legacy may be something less visible, but far more powerful, the creation of a written language. You sense that moment now as if history itself is pausing to take a deeper breath. It begins with an awareness of need. Without writing orders, travel only by word-of-mouth messages twist and change. Wisdom risks being lost in the drift of memory. Songtsen Gampo knows this, and he looks to the great civilizations around him. China writes with thousands of characters, India with scripts like Devanagari. Tibet, standing between them, must carve its own path. And so he sends a trusted minister, Thongmisambhota, across the passes to India to study the ancient Brahmi script and the art of recording sound into symbols. You imagine Thongmisambhota's journey winding mountain paths, rivers frothing below the constant crack of ice as glaciers shift above. He travels southward into India, where the air thickens with heat colours blaze in markets and scrolls fill monasteries with the wisdom of centuries. There he learns how letters can capture language, how thought itself can be held on paper. He copies, adapts, reshapes until Tibetan sounds can flow into symbols of their own. Then he returns carrying not just ink and parchment, but an entirely new tool for empire. A mainstream historical fact is that the Tibetan script developed in the 7th century was based on Indian models, but uniquely adapted to fit the Tibetan tongue. With it, laws could be written, treaties signed, prayers recorded. The plateau's oral culture now had a spine of ink and parchment. You picture the first scrolls unfurling the letters, sharp, elegant and strange monks, murmuring the sounds as they learned to trace them, children, repeating after teachers until the shapes sank into memory. And there is a curious tidbit tied to this script tradition holds that Thongmisambhota also composed the first Tibetan grammar, ensuring that not only words but the very rules of language were preserved. Imagine being in that room, watching him sit cross-legged, brush in hand, his breath steady as he lays out the bones of communication for an entire people. The brush scratches softly, the ink seeps into parchment, and in that moment a culture that once floated in the air of song and story begins to anchor itself in permanence. Historians still argue whether Songtsen Gampo himself commanded this innovation purely out of political necessity, or whether he also felt a deeper spiritual calling, desiring Buddhist text to be read and understood in the native tongue. Some insist his vision was pragmatic. Laws needed clarity, alliances needed records, taxes needed counts. Others argue that the king, touched by his queens and their devotion, sought a way for sacred words to live in Tibetan voices. You let the debate swirl around you, both answers carrying truth, the kind of truth that resists a single boundary. You step through an imagined school, the scent of burning butter lamps filling the air, parchment stretched on wooden frames. Students trace letters with trembling hands, their voices rising together as they recite. Outside, soldiers march through Lhasa's streets, merchants trade the city swells, but here in this quiet room, another conquest is taking place, one of knowledge and memory. The ink-stained fingers of children may one day carry more weight than the swords of warriors. And yet you also hear the murmurs of resistance. Elders of the Bond tradition grumble at this foreign script, suspicious of what it may bring, fearful that their chants and rituals, once passed only from master to disciple in secret, will now be overshadowed by new books and new gods. In their smoky chambers they whisper prayers against change, holding on to the old ways as tightly as the wind clings to the peaks. Still the momentum is unstoppable. As parchment fills with laws and prayers, as symbols multiply across scrolls, the identity of Tibet strengthens. You picture envoys from distant lands receiving letters sealed in wax, their eyes widening at the sight. Tibet, once a land of scattered clans, now speaks with written words as other empires do. The plateau, so high and remote, is no longer silent. It has found its voice pressed in ink, echoing across generations. As the day fades, you stand again at the Jokang temple, butter lamps flickering against the carved walls. Inside, monks now have texts to read, not only oral chants to recall, They bend over parchment by lamplight, their lips moving, their hands turning page after page. The wind outside carries their voices into the night, and you realize that this script is more than practical. It is magical, an invisible bridge across time. Long after kings rise and fall, these words will remain fluttering like prayer flags in the minds of those who read them. And as you step back into the cool darkness, the thin air sharp in your lungs, you sense that Tibet has taken its first great step toward permanence. The empire is not only land and armies now, but words preserved forever on parchment, humming softly like the wind itself. The scent of juniper drifts through the high air as you walk toward the valley of Lhasa. The name itself will come to echo for centuries, a city carved from dust and stone into a seat of empire, a place where both devotion and politics take root. You hear the murmur of workers, the ring of chisels against rock, the low chanting of monks mingling with the bustle of merchants. Lhasa, once a modest settlement, now swells like a living heart in the chest of Tibet. Imagine yourself entering its early streets. Yaks trudge through the lanes, their hooves striking against stone laden with salt wool and grain. Traders call out in a mixture of tongues, Nepalese, Chinese, Indian, each voice carrying the weight of distant roads. The market stalls overflow with turquoise beads, rolls of silk copper pots, and the sweet, earthy smell of dried apricots. Overhead, prayer flags flutter their colors, snapping against the high-altitude wind, carrying whispered blessings toward the endless blue sky. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Under Songtsen Gampo's reign, Lhasa began to transform into the administrative and spiritual capital of Tibet, centered around the Yokang temple, built to house sacred images brought by his queens. This temple drew monks and pilgrims, binding the empire not just by force, but by shared devotion. You step into its shadow, the butter lamps glowing, the scent of melted yak fat thick in the air. Devotees shuffle clockwise around its walls, fingering rosaries, whispering mantras, pressing foreheads to the stone. Curious details ripple beneath the surface. It is said that Princess Brakuti's image of the Buddha, known as the Jowo Rinpoche, was placed at the heart of Jokang. Locals whisper that the statue radiates a warmth of its own, its eyes alive, watching those who come before it. Some say that when the winds are particularly fierce, the statue seems to gleam more brightly, a reassurance that order can hold against chaos. You tilt your head and imagine the flicker of its golden face in the dim hall, its serenity unshaken by centuries. Historians still argue whether Lhasa's growth at this time was driven more by political will or by spiritual magnetism. Was it Songtsen Gampo's strategic decision to make this city a hub of governance, or was it the flow of pilgrims and monks drawn by holy images that made it thrive? Perhaps it was both a delicate weaving of sacred and statecraft, each reinforcing the other until Lhasa stood firm as the beating heart of empire. You walk out again into the streets where ministers stride past with scrolls under their arms, soldiers patrol in bronze helmets, and children play with wooden spinning tops, their laughter sharp against the thin air. Evenings bring festivals, torches, flickering drums, beating dancers, stamping their feet against the cold ground. The city feels alive with rhythm daylight for trade and law nightfall for prayer and song. As the city grows, so too do its walls. Stone fortresses rise, including the Red Fort atop Marpuri Hill. You climb its steep steps in your mind, the city spread beneath you in a patchwork of tents, homes, and market stalls. Smoke from hearths rises in curling streams, and beyond it all the mountains stand immovable, silent witnesses to human ambition. From here, Songtsen Gampo can gaze over his realm, The plateau no longer a scattering of tribes, but an empire taking form, its lifeblood pulsing through Lhasa. There is an ancient and curious tidbit whispered about these early years. Some say that under the Red Fort lived guardian spirits in the rock itself, protectors of the king who demanded offerings of barley and yak butter at each new season. Monks blending old beliefs with new would murmur prayers both to the Buddha and to the mountain deities, careful not to offend either. You pause, pressing your palm against the imagined stone wall, wondering if it still holds the echoes of those chants. As twilight falls, the city does not sleep. Butter lamps glow in windows, and the hum of recited sutras blends with the clatter of dice games played in the streets. In the courtyards, ministers debate policies, taxes, military campaigns, trade routes. Scrolls of law are unfurled, their ink still fresh, the new Tibetan script spreading like veins of ink across the land. The empire, once only an idea, now has a voice, a capital, and a rhythm. You breathe in the sharp night air, listening to the wind rattle the prayer flags overhead. Lhasa is still young, still fragile, but its foundations are strong. It is more than a city, it is a symbol, a gathering of people, faiths and ambitions into a single place where the fate of Tibet will be decided again and again. And as you linger in its streets, lulled by the steady murmur of prayer wheels turning in patient hands, you feel the city itself breathing a slow, deep exhale against the mountains, carrying Tibet's destiny into the centuries ahead. The air sharpens as you leave the growing city of Lhasa in your mind and follow the sound of drums and horns echoing across the mountain passes. The Tibetan Empire is no longer confined to its valleys, it presses outward, brushing against powerful neighbors. To the east lies the mighty Tang dynasty of China, a realm of silk scholars and formidable armies. And here at the borderlands, the clash between Tibet and Tang begins. You stand at a windswept frontier, the ground hard beneath your feet, snow still clinging to ridges even as summer warms the plains. Across the distance banners snap in opposite winds, Tibetan wolf-head standards against Chinese dragon motifs. Soldiers test their arrows, shields glitter, horses paw the ground, restless and heavy with anticipation. The silence between the two sides feels charged like the pause before thunder. A mainstream historical fact is that in the 7th century, Tibet and Tang China clashed repeatedly, their conflicts fueled by rival claims over trade routes and influence in Central Asia. The Battle of Dafei River in 638 CE, for instance, was one of the early confrontations where Songtsen Gampo's forces tested themselves against Tang troops. Though Tibet's armies were fierce, they met a formidable opponent, and the outcomes were often mixed, sometimes victory, sometimes retreat, but always sharpening the empire's ambitions. Yet in the midst of these battles, you hear the whispers of a curious tidbit. Some accounts suggest that before hostilities escalated, Songtsen Gampo sent lavish gifts to the Tang emperor, including a turquoise horse and piles of gold, requesting a Chinese princess in marriage. When the request was refused, Tibet struck in force, a reminder that diplomacy and warfare often walked hand in hand. You imagine the look on the emperor's face as he weighed tribute against pride, and the clatter of hoofbeats that followed when his refusal was answered with steel. Historians still argue whether these wars were born of genuine territorial hunger or whether they were symbolic contests of prestige, two young empires measuring themselves against each other. Some scholars emphasize Tibet's desire for control over the Silk Road's arteries, while others suggest that these clashes were as much about status, the right to be acknowledged as equal by the Chinese court. You let both possibilities hang in the thin air, hearing the clang of swords echo either way. The battlefield itself is harsh and unrelenting. You picture soldiers wrapped in heavy wool, faces smeared with ash to guard against sun, glare, their breath visible in the cold. Horses snort clouds of steam arrows whistle past, and the clash of bronze against iron rings out across the plain. To stand here, even in imagination, is to feel the raw edge of empire where destiny is tested not in quiet temples, but in the din of combat. And yet the wars with Tang were not endless bloodshed. They punctuated a relationship that shifted between hostility and alliance, sometimes flaring into battle, other times softening into trade and treaties. It is said that after one especially bitter clash, envoys exchanged silks and horses, kneeling before one another to forge peace. The frontier winds carry both sounds, the cry of warriors and the murmur of negotiators, a strange duet that will repeat for decades. You linger by a riverbank where soldiers once camped, fires hissing as snow melted into steam. Around them men sang to keep warm, voices weaving into the night while scouts rode silently along the ridges. Some prayed to the Buddha, fingering wooden beads, while others whispered to mountain spirits, begging for protection. In that blend of faiths, you sense Tibet's identity, a tapestry of old and new bound together in the crucible of war. Above it all, the sky darkens, clouds rolling like war banners across the peaks. Thunder growls in the distance, and you can almost believe the heavens themselves are watching this contest, weighing which empire will stand tallest. The wind rushes past your ears, and you feel both exhilaration and dread. For Tibet, the clashes with Tang are not only about land, they are about survival recognition and the bold gamble of standing shoulder to shoulder with one of the greatest powers of Asia. As you walk away from the battlefield, your steps slow and the sound of horns fades behind you. Yet the memory lingers, the glitter of weapons, the heat of horses, the uncertain line between victory and defeat. Tibet has declared itself to the world no longer a hidden kingdom on the plateau, but a force willing to fight, to bleed, to be heard. And in that declaration, the empire's story pushes forward louder than the wind that scours the high plains. The road before you stretches wide and dusty, the air tinged with the smell of camels and sweat of wool and spices carried from far-off lands. Here on the Silk Road, caravans thread like beads on a string, linking kingdoms across the vastness of Asia. And now, as Tibet's banners rise high, the empire extends its grip over this lifeline of wealth and power. You hear the low groan of wheels, the jangle of harness bells, and the murmur of merchants trading in half a dozen tongues. The Silk Road is not a single path, but a web winding through deserts, mountains, and valleys, carrying more than silk. It carries gold, jade, ivory, ideas, and faiths. You imagine walking beside the traders, their camels swaying with slow patience, their saddlebags stuffed with rolled silk blocks of tea and shining ingots. At night, fires flicker across the sand and stories ripple out of Chinese courts, glowing with lantern light of Indian temples, drenched in incense of Persian markets filled with music and wine. A mainstream historical fact comes into focus in the mid-7th century. Tibet extended its control over important segments of the Silk Road, especially the Gansu corridor, and routes into Central Asia. By securing these arteries, the Tibetan Empire was able to tax caravans, gather tribute, and position itself as a central broker of trade. You feel the weight of coins clinking in the merchants' pouches, hear the scribes tallying figures on scrolls by lamplight, and sense how prosperity flowed like a river into Lhasa. But listen closer, and you find a curious tidbit. Tibetan horsemen were so renowned that even far-off empires coveted them. Strong, sure-footed, and bred for the high plateau, these horses became prized trade items swapped for silks, silver, and even weapons. Some legends say that a single Tibetan steed was worth its weight in gold in distant markets, and that caravans would pause for days to bargain for them. You run your hand along the mane of one such horse in your imagination, its breath steaming in the cold, a living currency upon the road. Historians still argue whether Tibet's dominance over these routes was lasting or fleeting, whether it truly held a steady grip, or whether control slipped, often regained, only through repeated campaigns. Some accounts suggest Tibetan garrisons dotted the passes like watchful eyes, while others hint that authority was looser, more about intimidating presence than constant rule. You feel the uncertainty yourself watching guards in wolf-head helmets patrol dusty outposts, their eyes scanning the horizon for rival banners. By day the road teems with motion traders adjusting loads, scribes noting inventories, guards leaning on spears as the sun beats down. By night it transforms into a place of whispers. At the campfires, tales are exchanged not just of goods but of gods. Indian monks speak of the Buddha's compassion. Chinese scholars recount celestial patterns. Persian merchants recite poetry to the stars. The Silk Road is a highway not only of wealth but of ideas, and Tibet, perched astride it, absorbs every sound carried through its mountain gates. You step into a caravanserai, a roadside inn, where the air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and spiced tea. Merchants spread their wares on rugs, gems, glittering silk shimmering like water coins, clinking as they change hands. In the corner, a monk quietly reads from a scroll, while outside a soldier sharpens his sword, the rasp of stone on steel blending with the hum of voices. Here in the mingling of worlds you sense how Tibet's empire grows, not just by conquest, but by becoming the hinge of Asia itself. And yet, with wealth comes danger. Bandits lurk along the roads, eyes gleaming in the darkness, and rival empires tang China. The Turks and others watch hungrily, eager to seize these arteries. Every caravan must travel under guard, every trader knows the risk of ambush, every deal carries the tension of survival. Still the flow continues unstoppable, as if the desert itself demands movement. As the sun sets behind distant dunes, you walk with a caravan, the camels silhouetted against the fading light, their shadows stretching long. The wind carries the scent of dust and saffron, the promise of both peril and profit. And in the gathering dark you feel the empire's reach tightening around the Silk Road, its fingers closing on the lifeline that connects worlds. The Tibetan plateau, once remote, now hums with riches drawn from distant horizons. Coins clink into coffers, silks drape palace halls, and scrolls filled with new ideas unfurl in monasteries. The empire is no longer just a mountain stronghold. It is a crossroads of nations, its grip on the Silk Road tying its destiny to the pulse of Asia. The air grows drier as you leave the Silk Road behind and follow the empire's gaze westward across deserts and mountain corridors that seem endless in their expanse. You ride alongside the Tibetan forces as they push beyond their plateau, hooves kicking up dust banners, whipping against the unforgiving sky. Ahead lies Central Asia, fertile valleys, caravan towns, and the meeting ground of countless cultures. To hold these lands is to hold the crossroads of the world. A mainstream historical fact comes into focus under the reigns of Songtsen Gampo's successors. Tibet expanded westward into Central Asia, pressing into territories like Gilgit-Ladakh and the Tarim Basin. Control over these regions meant influence not only over trade, but also over the fragile buffer zones between powerful empires, the Tang to the east, the Arabs to the west, and the Turks to the north. You picture soldiers pausing at the rim of a desert, their faces wrapped in cloth, against the wind, their eyes fixed on the horizon where distant oases shimmer like mirages. You pass through one such oasis in your imagination, Kashgar, a city alive with markets where Indian, Persian, and Chinese traders meet. The smell of roasted lamb fills the air, silk glitters in the sun, and scrolls of poetry and scripture are recited beneath shaded courtyards. Tibetan envoys walk here, now their cloaks trimmed with fur, their tongues stumbling over foreign words as they negotiate taxes and treaties. In their hands are not only weapons, but parchments stamped with imperial seals asserting Tibet's claim to be a power that cannot be ignored. And yet you catch a curious tidbit whispered among travelers. Tibetan generals often took omens from the desert itself before battle. A dust devil twisting in the distance, a hawk circling above such signs, could mean victory or doom. Soldiers carried amulets of turquoise and yak bone, rubbing them nervously as they rode into the unknown. You imagine holding one yourself, the stone smooth from years of touch, a small anchor of hope against the immensity of sand and sky. Historians still argue whether these Western campaigns were driven more by economic ambition, securing the arteries of the Silk Road, or by a genuine desire to spread cultural influence. Some suggest that Tibet was desperate to control trade enriching its coffers, while others insist that the empire sought to stand as a peer among the great powers, proving its strength in the contested heart of Asia. You stand at the crossroads of these debates, feeling the pull of both interpretations, the weight of both ambition and survival. The march west is not easy. You hear the coughing of soldiers in the dry air, the scraping of boots against gravel, the muttered prayers to spirits of mountain and desert alike. Supplies are stretched thin, and every oasis becomes a prize worth guarding fiercely. At night, campfires dot the landscape like stars fallen to earth. Around them, men drink butter tea, their voices low, telling tales of home, of the snowy plateau of families, waiting of gods who watch from unseen heights. The desert swallows their words, leaving only the crackle of fire. Picture the moment when Tibetan troops crest a pass and see before them a caravan town brimming with riches. The streets are crowded with camels, the air heavy with spice, the sound of bargaining a constant hum. Yet beneath the wealth lies tension, local rulers shifting loyalties between Tang Tibetan and Arab envoys, playing one power against another. Here empire is less about armies marching and more about shadows moving across chessboards, each piece sliding carefully into place. Still the battles are real. Clashes erupt at oases, swords ringing beneath palm groves, arrows whistling over adobe walls. The air is filled with dust and cries, the outcome uncertain until the last charge breaks the line. Victories swell the empire's pride, but defeats remind it that these lands are harsh and that rivals are never far. You wander through one such battlefield long after the fighting ends. The silence is deep, broken only by the rustle of desert grass. Abandoned helmets gleam under the sun, half buried in sand, while vultures circle lazily above. Yet from this silence emerges the outline of empire and authority that now stretches from the icy heights of the plateau into the burning valleys of Central Asia. As twilight paints the desert gold, you ride westward with the soldiers, your breath dry, your body weary. The sky overhead is vast, endless, as if it could swallow all ambitions in a single sweep. And yet, against this immensity, Tibet dares to plant its banners, daring to claim lands far from home. You feel both the fragility and the audacity of it, the sense that this empire is reaching beyond its natural limits, but also the thrill that for a moment it succeeds. The hoofbeats fade into the dusk, mingling with the wind. The empire presses westward, its destiny etched not only in mountains but in deserts, its story expanding into the wide, contested heart of Asia. The wind howls through narrow valleys as you move further into the empire's depths, but tonight it carries more than dust. It carries chants, prayers, and the low rumble of conflict that is not fought with swords but with beliefs. The Tibetan Empire, strong in arms and wide in reach, is also a battlefield of the spirit. Here the old Bon religion, rooted in mountain worship and shamanic rites, collides with the rising tide of Buddhism, carried in by queens, monks and merchants. You walk through a settlement at twilight. In one corner, Bon priests gather around a roaring fire, tossing barley flour into the flames, chanting invocations to mountain deities. The sparks whirl upward like stars, and the air is thick with the smell of juniper smoke. Not far away, Buddhist monks in saffron robes light butter lamps before images of the Buddha, their chants low and rhythmic, a different rhythm of devotion. The two sounds overlap, weaving into a strange harmony that soon sharpens into tension. A mainstream historical fact grounds you while Songtsen Gampo is remembered for introducing Buddhism to Tibet. The older Bon tradition remained powerful among the people. The empire at this time was not purely Buddhist, but a land of competing faiths, each trying to shape the soul of the nation. You can feel that competition in the air, as if every prayer wheel spun by a monk is matched by every drumbeat of a Bon ritual. There is an ancient and curious tidbit. Bon priests were said to perform elaborate sky burials for the dead, offering bodies to vultures as a sacred act of returning flesh to the elements. You picture the silent circle of mountains, the great birds circling above the body, laid out with ritual precision. For the Bon, this was not horror, but release, a gift to the sky and earth. The Buddhists, however, argued their own teachings of karma and rebirth, sowing doubt in old practices. You sense the unease of families caught between two ways of honoring their dead, torn between tradition and new promise. Historians still argue whether Buddhism spread first among the elite queens, kings and courtiers, or whether it truly took root among common people early on. Was it a faith imposed from the top down, or a movement that stirred from the valleys upward? Some suggest it began as a tool of diplomacy, while others believe it quickly became a genuine devotion. As you drift between households, some with Bon shrines of carved horns and stones, others with small clay Buddhas glowing in lamplight, you feel the tug of both answers. The streets of Lhasa reflect this mingling. Markets buzz with merchants who sell both prayer beads and ritual drums. Storytellers weave Buddhist parables beside tales of mountain spirits. Children learn the new Tibetan script to copy Buddhist texts, but they still hear the old myths at night, whispered by their grandparents. It is a city of layers, belief folded upon belief, a quilt not yet fully stitched. You wander into a monastery at dawn. The monks' chants rise like a river of sound, filling the courtyard, until it seems the mountains themselves hum in response. But at the edges of the gathering, Bon priests scowl, muttering that the empire's soul is being stolen by foreign gods. Later, at a royal festival, you watch as both traditions attempt to impress the court. Bon shamans spinning in trance, their drums like thunder, while monks debate philosophy with calm, sharp voices. The audience shifts, restlessly pulled between spectacle and reason. This struggle is not only spiritual, it is political. To embrace Buddhism means aligning with powerful allies India and Tang China. To uphold Bon means holding on to native roots, the traditions of ancestors, the whisper of mountains. The empire is torn between looking outward and looking inward, and the tension hums like a taut bowstring. At night, you imagine the king himself lying awake, listening to the wind batter the palace walls. On one side, his Buddhist queen whispers sutras, her lamp flickering against scrolls of scripture. On the other, ministers remind him of the Bon priest's influence, the need to keep peace among clans. The decision weighs heavy, every choice a gamble with the future. The wind outside grows colder, carrying the scent of snow. You sense that this struggle is far from settled. It will echo across centuries, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in blood-shaping Tibet's identity, as much as any army ever could. For now, the land quivers between two worlds, old and new earth and sky, Bon and Buddhism, its destiny balanced like a flickering flame against the night. The plateau quiets for a moment in your imagination, as if the wind itself pauses to listen. A new ruler has ascended the throne, Trisong Detsen, grandson of Songtsen Gampo, and under his reign Tibet will step more firmly into the path of Buddhism. You feel the weight of his vision pressing outward, both bold and precarious, as he invites sages from distant lands to reshape the spirit of his empire. Trisong Detsen rises in the late 8th century, and you walk beside him as he surveys his kingdom. The red fort still stands over Lhasa, but its halls echo with more than just the shuffle of soldiers. Monks in saffron robes now gather their scrolls tucked under arms, their chants filling the courtyards. And yet the old Bon priests still linger, their eyes sharp, their drums rumbling in defiance. The king knows that if Buddhism is to thrive here, it must be firmly rooted, not swayed by the winds of rivalry. A mainstream historical fact guides you. In 775 CE, Trisong Detsen invited the great Indian master Shantarakshita to Tibet. This scholar-monk brought with him not only Buddhist philosophy, but also the practical knowledge of establishing monasteries. You picture his arrival, thin, robed in crimson, his eyes steady despite the daunting height of the plateau. With him comes the promise of a new order, where Buddhist teachings can be written, debated, and preserved. And yet the path is not smooth. A curious tidbit lingers in legend. When Shantarakshita first tried to build a monastery at Sami, disasters struck. Walls collapsed, floods swept foundations away, and eerie noises echoed through the valley at night. The people whispered that spirits of the land resisted, that Bon deities raged against the intrusion. Work halted, fear spreading like frost across the workforce. To answer this crisis, Trisong Detsen turned to another figure, the tantric master Padmasambhava, also known as Guru Rinpoche. You hear the whisper of his arrival in 775 CE, his presence like a storm cloaked in calm, eyes blazing with intensity, his hands carrying ritual implements that glint in the firelight. Padmasambhava confronted the restless spirits, binding them with chants and symbolic gestures, taming them into guardians rather than enemies. Imagine the night sky blazing with stars as his voice thundered across the valley, monks trembling at the power of his rites. In stories, mountains shook, demons bowed, and the path cleared for Buddhism to take root. Historians still argue whether these tales of Padmasambhava's power were literal events or mythic storytelling meant to explain cultural resistance. Was it truly magic, or was it a metaphor for overcoming Bon influence through ritual and compromise? The debate endures, but in either case you feel the triumph of that moment, an empire bending toward a new faith, its obstacles transformed into allies. You walk now into the halls of Sami, the first true monastery of Tibet, its layout designed as a mandala, a sacred map of the universe. The walls are painted with vivid murals, the floors echo with the shuffle of novices, the air dense with the smell of butter lamps and incense. Debates rise like flares, monks arguing the fine points of doctrine, their voices sharp but controlled, while outside the river rushes and the mountains keep silent watch. Trisong Detsen does not stop here. He orders texts translated into Tibetan, the script created in his grandfather's time, now serving its purpose as never before. Indian scholars and Tibetan scribes sit side by side, their brushes scratching their voices, murmuring as they wrestle with words that carry entire worlds of meaning. You stand at their shoulders watching the letters flow, and you sense how the empire is weaving itself into the great fabric of Buddhist civilization. And yet the struggle persists. Bon priests retreat but do not vanish. They adapt, sometimes incorporating Buddhist elements into their own rituals, sometimes resisting openly. In villages, families still turn to shamans for healing, even as they hang images of the Buddha on their walls. The empire's soul is not one thing, it is many, braided tightly together. As dusk deepens, you picture Trisong Detsen walking through the monastery courtyard, the chants of monks rising behind him. His face is lit by the glow of lamps, his mind heavy with the knowledge that he has altered Tibet forever. The plateau, once known only for its winds and peaks, is now a crucible of learning, faith, and cultural power. His vision has set it on a path that will echo for centuries. The stars emerge above Sami, glittering like jewels scattered across the velvet night. You hear the soft rustle of robes, the murmur of mantras, the faint rumble of distant drums. The empire breathes deeply, its body vast, its spirit newly awakened, its destiny stretching outward into the infinite sky. The wind shifts as you linger at Sami Monastery, carrying the sound of voices raised in debate rather than chant. It is not the noise of armies or markets, but the sharper music of minds testing one another. Here at the foot of the plateau, the fate of Tibetan Buddhism trembles on the outcome of a contest, the famous Sami debate. You walk into a great hall lit with butter lamps, their golden glow flickering against freshly painted murals. Monks are gathered in rows, cross-legged, their eyes intent. In the center sit two opposing masters, Kamalashla, the Indian scholar brought by Trisong Detsen, and Mohayan, a Chinese Chan monk who advocates a path of sudden enlightenment. The air is thick with expectation, every breath drawn tight as bowstrings. A mainstream historical fact grounds you around 792-794 CE. The Sami debate was held under the sponsorship of Trisong Detsen to determine which school of Buddhist thought would dominate Tibet. The two sides clashed in philosophy, Kamalashla championing gradual cultivation through meditation and study, Mohayan urging direct, instantaneous awakening of the mind. You close your eyes and listen. Mohayan's voice is quiet but firm like a stream flowing fast and sure. He insists that enlightenment is immediate, that grasping and striving are themselves obstacles. Kamalashla responds with calm precision, his words deliberate, building argument upon argument like stones in a wall. He warns that without gradual training the mind risks confusion and false attainment. The monks lean forward, the room tilting between these two voices, the flicker of the lamps throwing shadows that dance as if the debate itself shapes the air. There is a curious tidbit preserved in Tibetan lore. Some say the debate lasted not just days, but 2 full years, with long pauses, rehearsed arguments, and sudden flares of rhetorical brilliance. Others claim the contest was far shorter, a matter of weeks. Either way, the image is powerful. You see monks slipping out at dusk to continue discussions by firelight, their whispers carrying under the stars, their lives consumed by questions too vast for easy answers. Historians still argue whether the Sami debate truly ended in a single decisive victory for the Indian side as Tibetan tradition records, or whether the story was later shaped to give authority to gradualist practices. Some suggest the account was written retrospectively to bolster a chosen orthodoxy, erasing nuances of what really occurred. You feel the tension of that uncertainty as you stand in the imagined hall where truth itself seems to shimmer like heat on stone. The king listens carefully, his face stern, his hand resting on the arm of his throne. Trisong Detsen is not merely a bystander. He knows this choice will guide the soul of his empire. In time, he declares Kamalashla the victor, and the gradual path of discipline and meditation becomes the official doctrine of Tibet. Yet, even as Mohayan departs, his teachings do not vanish. In valleys and villages, whispers of sudden enlightenment continue blending with local practice, like embers glowing long after the fire seems out. Step outside the hall and you hear monks reciting the sutras, their voices carrying into the night. Inside their cells they pore over texts, translated into Tibetan, the script flowing steady across parchment. Some train in meditation for hours, eyes closed, breaths deep and slow. Others wander in thought, questioning whether enlightenment might still come in a single flash, despite the king's decree. You imagine the monastery grounds at dawn, frost glistening on the grass, prayer flags trembling against the early light. Kamalashla, weary but triumphant, walks the courtyards, his mind already turning to further teachings. Mahayan, his robes dark with dust, prepares to leave Tibet, his disciples lingering in doorways with eyes full of both loss and quiet determination. Their paths diverge, but their voices both remain in the echoes of Tibetan thought. As you drift away from Sami, the sound of the debate lingers in your ears, sharper than drums, more enduring than swords. The Tibetan Empire has not only expanded its borders, but also defined its spirit through words and ideas. The battlefield of philosophy proves just as decisive as any fought with spears and shields. The plateau stretches again before you, vast and unyielding, but now it hums with the memory of minds clashing like thunderclouds, a contest that set Tibet upon its unique path of faith and study. And in the hush of evening you realize that the empire is no longer merely a political power, it is also a spiritual torch, its flame flickering but unextinguished against the high winds of history. The night sky spreads above you like a velvet dome, stars sharp and countless as you drift with the Tibetan armies moving far from home. The empire, still young, has grown hungry. No longer satisfied with survival or even unity, it now seeks tribute. Submission from foreign courts, wealth streaming back to the plateau. You feel the stir of ambition in every hoofbeat, every drumroll, every shout of command echoing across the mountains. A mainstream historical fact shines clear. During the late 8th century, the Tibetan Empire expanded aggressively, taking territories from Nepal to Central Asia, and even reaching into Chinese lands. Victories brought foreign states into tribute relationships, their rulers sending silk grain or precious metals to Lhasa as signs of submission. The empire's reach stretched far beyond its icy plateau, its armies feared as much as any in Asia. You imagine one such campaign soldiers riding into the valleys of Nepal, their armor gleaming in the thin sunlight. Towns capitulate rather than risk ruin their leaders, bowing low, offering gold and livestock. In far-off cities of Central Asia, Tibetan envoys arrive at courts, their wolf-head banners unfurled demanding tribute. The air of these foreign courts thickens with unease. To refuse is to invite a storm of steel and fire. And yet there is a curious tidbit whispered in travelers' accounts. Tibetan warriors were known to carry portable shrines with them, small wooden altars tucked into their saddlebags. Before battles, they would dismount light butter lamps and offer prayers to both Buddhist deities and mountain spirits, asking for protection. Imagine the glow of tiny flames flickering in the darkness of a desert night, a circle of warriors kneeling, their armor glinting in the firelight, chanting softly before the clash of arms. Historians still argue whether Tibet's dominance in this era was the result of sheer military might, or whether it owed more to the fragmentation of its rivals. Tang China was weakened by internal rebellions like the An Lushan uprising, and Central Asia fractured into competing powers. Was Tibet truly stronger, or did it simply rise when others stumbled? The debate continues, but as you march beside the soldiers, you sense both truth and fortune in their victories. In your imagination you pass through conquered lands, At city gates, envoys unfurl Tibetan decrees, their voices ringing against stone walls. Farmers bend under new taxes, their barley carried off to feed foreign garrisons. Local rulers kneel with offerings, their faces pale, uncertain if loyalty will protect them when empires shift again. And yet in Lhasa the coffers swell, markets fill with foreign luxuries, Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian silver. Monks chant over imported scriptures, scribes record treaties, artisans craft golden statues for temples funded by tribute. At night you stand by a campfire on campaign, the wind fierce, the ground hard. Soldiers huddle under heavy cloaks, passing bowls of butter tea, laughing in rough voices, boasting of the loot waiting in distant towns. One plucks a lute, its tune bending strangely in the wind, while another gazes at the stars, muttering that every victory feels smaller beneath the infinite sky. The fire pops and hisses, sparks scattering like fleeing spirits. You walk on past the edge of empires where Tibetan banners fly over caravan towns. Merchants bow low, offering silver coins and bolts of silk. Tibetan officials record every payment, their brushes scratching across parchment, tallying wealth. The empire no longer hides in the mountains. It strides openly onto the stage of Asia, its power undeniable. Yet beneath the triumph, shadows grow. Tribute brings wealth, but also resentment. Conquered peoples grumble, waiting for moments of weakness. Rival empires eye Tibet with suspicion, preparing to reclaim what was lost. You sense the weight of ambition pressing heavy on the empire, its reach wide, its grip strong but not unbreakable. As dawn breaks, you stand on a ridge overlooking a conquered valley. Smoke rises from hearths below, banners flutter, and the sound of distant bells carries on the wind. For now Tibet reigns supreme, its might undeniable, its name carried far across deserts and mountains. The empire has tasted tribute, and it hungers for more. The wind sharpens cold and thin as you climb a ridge and look out over an empire at its peak. From the snowy plateau, Tibetan banners now stretch across a staggering sweep of Asia, eastward into Chinese territory, south toward Bengal, west into Central Asia. For a brief glittering moment in the 8th century, Tibet stands not as a hidden kingdom, but as one of the great powers of the world. A mainstream historical fact grounds this vision. In 763 CE, Tibetan forces captured Chang'an, the dazzling capital of Tang China, during a time when the Tang dynasty was weakened by rebellion. Imagine the sight: wolf-head banners fluttering at the gates of a city famous for its grandeur, Tibetan soldiers riding down avenues lined with palaces and gardens. Though their hold was brief, the symbolism resounded across Asia. The plateau had produced an empire capable of seizing even the heart of China. You walk through the imagined streets of Chang'an with them. The markets are stunned into silence, silk spilling from overturned carts, mandarins retreating into courtyards, incense smoke curling above empty temples. Tibetan soldiers stare in awe at a city more immense than any they've ever seen, its walls stretching to the horizon, its avenues wide enough for 10 horsemen abreast. Some whisper that the world has turned upside down. The mountain folk now masters of the valley empire. And yet there is a curious tidbit buried in Tibetan chronicles. When the soldiers entered Chang'an, they installed a puppet emperor for only 2 weeks before withdrawing. Some say it was a symbolic gesture rather than a serious attempt at rule meant to humiliate the Tang and proclaim Tibet's superiority. Others whisper that the soldiers longed for home, unable to endure the lowland humidity, their lungs aching for the cold clarity of the plateau. You can almost feel that longing yourself, as if even victory in the richest city of Asia could not replace the thin, sharp air of Tibet. Historians still argue whether Tibet's empire at this zenith was truly stable or merely stretched too thin. On maps, the borders gleam encompassing Nepal, Ladakh, much of Central Asia, and even parts of Persia through shifting alliances. But were these lands truly governed, or were they fragile tributaries ready to slip away when attention faltered? You stand on that edge of uncertainty, sensing both the grandeur and the fragility of an empire pulled in every direction at once. Picture Lhasa at this moment of triumph. The markets overflow with goods, Chinese porcelains, Indian spices, Persian textiles. Envoys from distant courts arrive daily, their tongues heavy with compliments, their hands full of gifts. Monks chant in grand halls funded by foreign tribute, their voices echoing off newly painted murals of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. The Red Fort brims with ministers who shuffle through scrolls detailing taxes and campaigns, their lamps burning late into the night. And yet in the shadows murmurs rise. Soldiers grow weary of endless marches, their boots worn thin, their families waiting at home. Farmers groan under taxes, barley carts creaking along mountain roads. Local lords, proud of their valleys, chafe at distant orders. Even in the height of glory, you hear the first strains of unrest, faint but steady like cracks spreading across ice. One evening you sit at the edge of a camp beyond the empire's heart. The fires burn low, casting orange light on the soldiers' faces. Some boast of victories, of sacking towns, of returning with silks and gold. Others stare silently into the flames, their eyes hollow with the weight of distance. One man whispers that empires are like fire, they burn brightest just before they begin to dim. The words linger, carried by the wind into the dark. Still the empire shines for now. From Bengal's lush valleys to Chang'an's glittering gates, from Kashgar's markets to the monasteries of Samye Tibet, commands respect and fear. You watch its banners ripple across the horizon, brilliant against the deep sky. For this fleeting moment it seems unstoppable, a kingdom of mountains that has conquered the plains. And as you turn your gaze back to the plateau, its peaks silver in the moonlight, you realize how rare such heights are. Few empires ever stand so tall. Fewer still manage to remain there. The wind that once carried the songs of victory now feels heavier, tinged with unease. You walk again through the Red Fort at Lhasa, its halls alive with ministers and generals, but the tone has shifted. The empire has reached its zenith, and already the weight of succession and rivalry presses against its walls. Shadows lengthen in the flicker of butter lamps, and whispers of doubt echo through the stone corridors. A mainstream historical fact anchors the unease, following the heights of the empire under Trisong Detsen. Tibet faced recurring struggles of succession. The passing of a strong king often left the throne contested with heirs too young or factions too divided to secure authority. You picture the throne room, the seat of power, draped in silk, but empty, its very emptiness more frightening than any enemy at the gate. In the marketplaces, people murmur of ministers gaining too much sway, of generals growing ambitious, of governors far away in Central Asia acting as kings in all but name. Tribute still flows into Lhasa, but the channels feel strained, clogged by corruption and rivalry. You sense the empire's pulse, slowing each beat heavier, as though even its heart grows weary. A curious tidbit surfaces from Tibetan law. It is said that when disputes over succession grew fierce, divinations were sometimes performed, using the bones of animals or the cast of dice, as if fate itself might reveal which heir should rise. You imagine monks tossing carved dice across a cloth, their eyes fixed on the patterns, while outside soldiers sharpen swords in case the god's answer does not satisfy the living. Historians still argue whether these internal tensions mattered more than the pressure of foreign rivals. Was it the squabbling of ministers and heirs that eroded the empire from within, Or was it the constant strain of war with Tang Arabs and Central Asian tribes that finally stretched it too thin? You can feel both arguments flicker in the candlelight of Lasa's chambers, each as sharp and real as the steel of the swords hanging on the walls. You step into one such council chamber. Ministers argue, their voices rising, their fingers stabbing at maps sprawled across the table. Some demand more campaigns to keep rivals cowed, others insist the empire needs peacetime to breathe, to rebuild. The king's young heir sits silently, eyes lowered a pawn in a game too vast for his age. Outside the city hums with unease, sensing that the unity once felt is fraying. In distant provinces, the signs of strain grow sharper. Governors demand more autonomy, their loyalty thinner with each passing year. Soldiers, tired of endless marches, desert to their villages, taking their weapons with them. Families whisper of shortages, merchants grumble about taxes, pilgrims mutter that the gods seem quieter. You walk among them, and the air feels heavier, as though even the mountains themselves sense that change is coming. And yet, Tibet still appears strong to outsiders. Banners still fly high, monks still chant, the coffers still clink with coins. The empire's mask gleams, even as cracks spread beneath. It is a strange duality. You see the empire from afar as unshakable, but within its halls you feel the strain of men and women, clutching power with white knuckles, their voices louder because their confidence is weaker. At night, you sit at the edge of the city, prayer flags snapping in the wind above you. Behind you, Lhasa glows with lamplight, but ahead the mountains loom dark and silent. Somewhere in those shadows, warlords are already plotting rival factions, sharpening blades and heirs, dreaming of thrones that may never be theirs. The stars above glitter coldly, indifferent to the quarrels of men. The empire stands at the height of its power, but beneath the surface a slow unraveling begins. You sense it in the restless wind, in the murmurs of the people, in the shifting eyes of ministers. A storm gathers not from foreign banners on the horizon, but from within, from the fragile balance of succession and ambition. And as you listen, you realize the empire's greatest battles may not be fought on foreign soil, but in its own halls, where shadows whisper louder than war drums. The chill of the plateau deepens as you drift further into the empire's story, and the shadow of a single ruler looms heavy Langdharma. His reign, brief yet infamous, feels like a storm cloud rolling over the mountains, darkening temples and silencing chants. You walk through Lhasa in your mind, its streets unsettled, its people whispering with both fear and defiance. A mainstream historical fact guides you. Langdharma came to power in the mid-9th century and is remembered in Tibetan chronicles as hostile to Buddhism. Where earlier kings like Trisong Detsen had built monasteries, Langdharma is said to have closed them. Monks were forced to return to lay life texts, hidden or burned, and the empire's carefully nurtured Buddhist culture staggered under sudden pressure. You hear the echo of doors slamming shut, the heavy silence where chants once filled the dawn air. The city itself changes tone under his reign. Imagine the Jokang temple shuttered, its golden Buddha hidden behind locked doors. Monks walk quickly, eyes lowered, their saffron robes swapped for plain garments. Bon priests step into the open again, their drums echoing at festivals, their chants filling the streets with vigor. The balance of faith that once quivered uncertainly now tilts sharply, and the empire trembles under the strain. A curious tidbit lingers in Tibetan lore. Langdharma was said to be marked by ominous features, blackened lips, a dark complexion, and eyes that glared like embers. Some claimed he was possessed by hostile spirits, others whispered he was an incarnation of wrathful deities. Whether fact or embellishment, his image in memory is monstrous, his very presence unsettling to those who dared to oppose him. You pause, imagining his stern gaze, flickering in the lamplight of the throne room, cold and unyielding. Historians still argue whether Langdharma's persecution of Buddhism was truly as severe as the chronicles describe, or whether later Buddhist writers exaggerated his cruelty to frame him as a villain. Some believe his rule represented a pragmatic swing back toward traditional practices, an attempt to stabilize the empire by appeasing Bon priests and old aristocracies. Others insist his policies were indeed violent and repressive, casting a dark pall over Tibetan spiritual life. You stand in that uncertainty, the truth shifting like mist over the mountains. Still, the fear in the streets is palpable. Families whisper in their homes, hiding sacred images behind curtains, pressing prayer beads into walls for safekeeping. Monks flee into the countryside, some disguising themselves as travelers, others wandering into caves where they continue their chants in secret. You walk through one such hidden cave, its walls damp and cold butter lamps flickering faintly. The monks' voices are soft but unbroken, carrying into the stone like a heartbeat, steady even as the world outside turns hostile. Meanwhile, the empire itself strains under the weight of his reign. Soldiers, restless after generations of expansion, feel neglected. Ministers whisper in corners, unsure whether Langdharma's suppression of Buddhism strengthens or weakens the state. The air grows heavy with suspicion. At court, smiles are thin, alliances brittle. You sense that Tibet, vast and proud, is being hollowed from within by mistrust and fear. Night falls over Lhasa, and you wander through streets where once chants rose joyfully. Now the sound is different, the rattle of Bon drums, the wail of horns, the laughter of priests restored to power. Yet beneath it, like a hidden stream, you still hear the murmur of Buddhist mantras whispered in defiance, carried in secret from lips to ears, from heart to heart. The empire has not lost its soul, though it flickers like a lamp in the wind. Langdharma walks through his palace, his shadows stretching long, his presence felt in every corner of the capital. For some, he is a restorer of old ways. For others, a tyrant who darkens Tibet's destiny. Either way, his reign is heavy, and its weight presses against the fragile unity of the empire. As you drift away into the night, the stars glitter coldly distant and untouched. The empire still stands, but something within it feels cracked, unstable, and you sense that the balance cannot hold much longer. The shadow of Langdharma will not last forever, but its darkness marks a turning point from which the empire may never fully recover. The night around you grows colder, and the air feels taut, as though the empire itself holds its breath. Langdharma still rules in Lhasa, but his shadow grows heavy and unsteady. You hear footsteps echoing in the palace corridors, sharper than usual, cloaks brushing against stone, the muted scrape of blades concealed beneath robes. Something is about to break. A mainstream historical fact emerges from the silence. Langdharma's reign ended suddenly in 842 CE, when he was assassinated by a Buddhist monk, often said to be disguised as a dancer. One arrow, loosed in a moment of daring, ended the life of a king and shattered the fragile balance of the empire. You imagine that instant, the twang of the bowstring cutting the air, the sharp hiss of the arrow, the stunned silence before the king crumpled. In your mind, you walk through the halls just before the act. Butter lamps flicker weakly, their light trembling across carved beams. Langdharma sits in state, his face stern, his lips thin, his eyes scanning the room with suspicion. Around him, ministers murmur, soldiers shift uncomfortably, priests bow low. And then music begins. A performer steps forward, cloaked in costume, a bow hidden within the folds. What seems a dance of ritual spirals into a strike of destiny. The curious tidbit that lingers in Tibetan lore is vivid. The assassin known as Lalung Pelgi Dorje supposedly painted half his horse white and half black, a strange omen of balance and contradiction. After shooting the king, he fled across rivers and mountains, vanishing into legend, said to have hidden in caves where he meditated for years beyond the reach of vengeance. You picture his flight through the thin air, hooves pounding against the plateau, the horse shimmering like twilight itself. Historians still argue whether Langdama's assassination was truly a lone act of defiance by a monk or part of a larger conspiracy among Buddhist factions and ministers. Was the arrow shot by one hand or by a movement desperate to restore their faith? The question hovers unresolved like the faint echo of that bowstring in the wind. You stand in Lhasa after the deed, the city stunned. Some cheer quietly in corners, whispering that the gods themselves struck down the persecutor. Others grieve openly, fearful of chaos now that the throne lies empty. Ministers scramble for power, generals weigh their loyalties, and families bar their doors against what may follow. The silence of the Yokang temple breaks into cautious chant, again monks daring to emerge from shadows, though their eyes still dart nervously at every sound. The palace itself feels hollow. You wander its corridors past guards with pale faces and trembling hands. The throne is empty once more, silk drapes swaying gently in the draught, as though the room sighs with relief or dread. Outside, the people murmur of omens, of strange lights in the sky, of ravens circling over the fort, of the sound of thunder rolling clear on a cloudless night. Every sign is read as confirmation that Tibet stands at a threshold. Night deepens and the air grows heavy with uncertainty. The empire has lost its king, but more than that, it has lost its balance. Succession is unclear, factions sharpen their ambitions, and the fragile unity of the plateau trembles like a lamp in the wind. You feel the weight of silence pressing down, a silence that comes not from peace, but from waiting for decisions, for struggles, for the storm that follows a single arrow. As dawn breaks pale and cold, the mountains gleam with cruel beauty, indifferent to the turmoil below. The assassination has ended a dark reign, but it has also unmoored the empire from its center. What began as a sudden strike in the shadows will ripple outward, shattering borders, breaking loyalties, and unraveling the great tapestry woven by generations of kings. And as you stand at the edge of Lhasa, watching the sun climb over the horizon, you realize that the Tibetan Empire, once so mighty, has stepped onto a path of fragmentation. The bowstring has loosed more than an arrow, it has loosed the unraveling of an age. The air over the plateau feels different now, thin not only from altitude, but from tension. With Langdama's death, the steady rhythm of empire falters. You walk through Lhasa's streets, no longer thrumming with triumph, but buzzing with unease. Ministers mutter in corners, soldiers shuffle their feet, and common people glance at one another with uncertainty. Without a clear king, the Tibetan Empire begins to splinter. A mainstream historical fact grounds this unraveling. After Langdama's assassination in 842 CE, Tibet entered a period of civil war and fragmentation. Rival heirs claimed the throne and regional warlords seized the chance to assert independence. The once mighty empire began to fracture into smaller kingdoms, each pulling away from the center. You can almost hear the sound of silk banners tearing threads, snapping one by one. You picture the succession crisis clearly. Langdama left behind two sons, Yumten and Osung, each supported by different factions. Nobles, generals, and priests lined up behind one or the other, turning the throne into a prize rather than a symbol of unity. Civil war erupted. The sound of steel against steel echoed in valleys that once rang with chants and bells. Villages were drawn into conflict, their fields trampled, their families torn between loyalties. And here comes a curious tidbit. Chronicles say that some ministers attempted to hide one of the heirs in secret, disguising him and spiriting him away to protect him from rivals. Tales of children carried under cover of night, slipping across rivers with only the stars to guide them, linger in memory like ghost stories. Whether these accounts are fact or legend, they reveal how fragile the royal line had become, so fragile that it needed to be hidden like a flame sheltered from wind. Historians still argue whether the empire's collapse was inevitable given its overextension, or whether it was truly the succession crisis that tore it apart. Was Tibet doomed by geography and ambition, spread too thin across deserts and valleys, or was it the arrow that killed Langdharma which tipped the balance? You stand in the middle of that debate, feeling both arguments press like the cold wind against your chest. You walk into the countryside now, where the empire's reach once seemed endless. Villages no longer fly imperial banners. Instead, local lords raise their own standards, their power more immediate than any distant king's. Soldiers patrol not for the empire, but for a clan or province. Monks debate whether to support one heir or another, while bond priests reclaim influence in valleys where imperial monks had once dominated. The plateau no longer hums with one heartbeat, but many, irregular and restless. In distant strongholds, warlords carve out domains of their own. Some ally with foreign powers, the Tang in China, the Uyghurs in Central Asia, even Indian kingdoms across the Himalayas. You see their envoys slipping through mountain passes, carrying treaties that betray the dream of a united Tibet. At night, the fires of separate camps glow across the horizon, not as a single flame, but as scattered sparks, each jealously guarded, none willing to merge. Imagine walking through a former garrison town, once soldiers here, trained under a banner of empire, their orders flowing from Lhasa. Now, two rival commanders argue in the streets, their men glaring at each other across the marketplace. Merchants no longer know whom to pay taxes to. They hand over coins to both, hoping to survive the next raid. The air is thick with suspicion, the rhythm of life fractured, and yet despite the turmoil you notice resilience. Farmers still plant barley in the spring, shepherds still drive their yak across the high meadows, mothers still tell children the old stories of gods and kings. The empire may fracture, but the people endure their lives, continuing against the backdrop of political chaos. It is as if the mountains themselves teach endurance, reminding all who live here that kingdoms rise and fall, but the plateau abides. As twilight deepens, you stand at a mountain pass, overlooking the divided land. Fires burn in the valleys below, not as one but as many, each flickering with ambition and fear. The empire has lost its center, its heart pulled in too many directions at once. You feel the wind tear past you, cold and relentless, carrying away the last echoes of unity. The Tibetan Empire is no longer one voice. It is a chorus of fragments, each louder because none can command the whole. And as you turn away from the pass, you sense that the long age of empire has ended. What comes now is something smaller, more fragile, and yet still echoing with the memory of greatness. The plateau feels emptier now, as though the air itself remembers what has been lost. You walk across valleys where Tibetan banners once flew proudly, only to find them tattered or gone altogether. The empire, once so vast, begins to collapse in slow, uneven waves, its edges fraying first, then its heart. Each step you take seems to carry you further from unity and deeper into fragmentation. A mainstream historical fact grounds this decline after Langdharma's assassination and the ensuing civil wars. Tibet's imperial authority dissolved by the mid-9th century. Territories once held in Central Asia, Nepal and Bengal slipped away, claimed by rivals or reclaimed by their own rulers. even within Tibet regions broke free under local warlords and clans, leaving Lhasa's central power hollow. By the late 800s, the Tibetan Empire as it had existed was no more. You imagine a caravan once bound for Lhasa, now diverted. Instead of paying taxes to imperial officials, merchants negotiate with local chiefs, handing over bolts of silk and sacks of salt at border posts that did not exist a generation ago. The Silk Road, once pulsing with wealth under Tibetan watchflows elsewhere, bypassing the plateau. You can almost hear the silence left behind, the sudden emptiness of markets once filled with voices and coin. And here, in that silence, a curious tidbit emerges. Chronicles tell of monks smuggling sacred texts into caves during these years of turmoil. They hid them in clay jars, sealed with wax, burying them deep within the earth, praying that one day stability would return. Centuries later, some of these treasures would be rediscovered in places like Dunhuang, their pages intact, their voices whispering across time. You kneel in the dust of such a cave in your mind, brushing away cobwebs, your fingers trembling as you touch parchment that survived while kingdoms crumbled. Historians still argue whether the collapse of the Tibetan Empire should be seen as a sudden fall or a gradual unraveling. Was the arrow that killed Langdharma the true breaking point, or had the empire already overstretched, destined to fracture under its own weight, some point to economic strain, others to foreign pressure, still others to the fragility of succession? You stand amid the ruins of a fortress, its walls half fallen, and feel the truth. Perhaps it was all of these converging like storms until the empire simply could not endure. You wander through one such fortress. Once alive with soldiers and banners, it now lies silent. Moss creeps across its stones, the wind whistles through empty windows, and a prayer flag long faded flaps weakly from a crumbling tower. Below, the fields are still tended by farmers, but their allegiance belongs not to empire but to local lords whose names barely echo beyond the valley. The might of Tibet is gone, but life carries on, smaller, quieter. In villages, families gather at night around fires, telling stories of the great empire that once was. Children listen wide-eyed as elders recount how Tibetan armies marched into China, how kings built monasteries that gleamed with gold, how the plateau commanded respect across Asia. These tales feel almost mythical now, like dreams of a past too grand to be real. Yet you can sense the pride that remains even as the empire itself has faded. At the same time, you notice unease. Without the unifying power of Lhasa Valley's feud, with Valley's warlords raid neighbors and monasteries sometimes clash as much as they pray. A single land has become many pieces, jagged and restless. The echo of empire lingers like a ghost, haunting every conflict, reminding each faction of what once bound them together. Night descends as you walk across the plateau. The stars burn bright, cold, and eternal, indifferent to the struggles below. Fires burn in scattered strongholds, small islands of power in a sea of darkness. You feel the silence press heavy, broken only by the distant howl of wolves. The empire has fallen, not with a single crash, but with a long drawn-out exhale, leaving only fragments behind. And yet as you pause, you sense that this is not the end of Tibet's story. The empire may be gone, but its memory lingers in stone, in scrolls, in whispers, carried by the wind. Something remains, waiting to be reborn, in a different form, in a different time. For now, though, the plateau settles into silence, its empire a shadow stretched thin across the mountains. The plateau is quieter now, but in that quiet you hear something new, soft chanting rising from hidden valleys, the flicker of butter lamps glowing inside caves, the resilience of monks who refuse to let their faith die. The empire may have collapsed, its armies scattered and its banners torn, but Buddhism in Tibet does not vanish. Instead, it finds new soil in which to grow, sparking what later generations will call the Buddhist Renaissance. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment after the fall of the Tibetan Empire in the 9th century. The so-called era of fragmentation began. For 2 centuries, Tibet lacked a unified state, yet during this time Buddhism was preserved by small communities of monks and lay followers. In the 10th and 11th centuries, renewed contact with India sparked a revival, bringing fresh translations, new teachings, and the rise of monasteries that would reshape Tibetan culture. You step into one of those mountain caves. The walls glisten with moisture, the air cold and close, but the butter lamps flicker steadily, casting golden halos across piles of manuscripts. Monks whisper sutras, their voices hushed, yet firm, as they copy sacred texts by hand. Each brushstroke feels like defiance, each word a seed planted for the future. Outside, warlords may fight and kingdoms may crumble, but inside these caves, the spirit of the empire's faith endures. A curious tidbit glimmers from the stories. Some monks disguise themselves as shepherds, carrying scrolls hidden in sacks of wool, moving between valleys under the guise of tending flocks. Others buried texts in sealed jars, hidden beneath fields or tucked into cliffs where they might survive centuries. You imagine stumbling upon one of these caches centuries later, brushing dirt from clay, the ancient script still legible, the voices of the past still alive. Historians still argue whether Buddhism's survival during this era owed more to foreign support, fresh transmissions from Indian masters, or to the stubborn devotion of Tibetans who refused to let it fade. Was it India's flame reigniting Tibet, or Tibet's own embers glowing stubbornly beneath the ashes? Perhaps it was both blending into a renewal stronger than either alone. You feel that ambiguity as you walk through a monastery courtyard, the chants of monks mingling with the soft toll of a bell. By the 10th century, new teachers arrive from India, their presence like sparks in dry grass. They bring tantric practices, complex rituals, and fresh scriptures. Tibetan translators work tirelessly to capture every word, their brushes scratching late into the night. You watch them in your mind's eye, ink staining their fingers, their concentration so fierce that they scarcely notice the wind rattling the shutters. The revival is not merely scholarly, it is also artistic. Artists carve statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas with serene faces, their bronze and gold gleaming in the lamplight. Painters decorate monastery walls with vast mandalas, cosmic maps that swirl with color, guiding minds toward enlightenment. You step into one of these halls, the scent of incense sharp, your eyes dazzled by the brilliance of blues, reds, and golds. Even without empire, Tibet creates beauty that endures. Villages, too, feel the change. Families once torn between Bon and Buddhism begin to weave the two together. Shrines to mountain spirits stand beside prayer wheels, and offerings are made to both gods and Buddhas. The people of Tibet do not erase their past, they fold it into something new, layered and complex, a faith that belongs uniquely to the plateau. Night deepens and you sit beside a stream running silver under the stars. The water's murmur blends with the faint sound of chanting from a nearby hermitage. The empire is gone, its armies scattered, its rulers forgotten. And yet the essence of Tibet persists in the steady rhythm of prayer, in the devotion of monks and villagers, in the whisper of sutras carried on the wind. The Buddhist Renaissance does not restore the empire's borders, but it preserves its soul. You sense it glowing like a coal in the dark, small, fragile, but alive. And from that coal, flames will rise again, not of conquest, but of wisdom and culture, shaping Tibet's destiny for centuries to come. The winds of the plateau still howl, but now they carry not the disciplined tramp of imperial armies, but the scattered movements of clans, nomads, and small kingdoms. The Tibetan Empire has collapsed, and in its place lie fragments patchwork. Polities ruled by warlords, chieftains, and monks who each claim authority in their valleys and fortresses. You drift among them feeling the land itself shift from unity into restless mosaic. A mainstream historical fact frames this time, the centuries after the fall of the empire, roughly the 10th to 12th centuries, are known as the era of fragmentation. Central authority disappeared, replaced by rival dynasties such as the descendants of Langdama's heirs, local kings in Ngari and Kham, and the rise of religious lineages who wielded both spiritual and temporal influence. Tibet, once an empire spanning Asia, had become a land of many small powers, each jostling for dominance. Imagine yourself in Ngari, Western Tibet, where the descendants of imperial bloodlines claim to be the rightful rulers. Their castles cling to rocky ridges, their halls hung with banners depicting the glories of their ancestors. Ministers argue about lineage while outside farmers plough narrow fields with yak, their eyes downcast, weary of endless taxes demanded by lords who cannot match the might of the past. In Kham and Amdo, fierce warrior clans control valleys, their loyalty bought and broken in cycles as swift as the wind. And yet there is a curious tidbit hidden in this time of division. Many nomadic groups, free from imperial demands, flourished. Without armies conscripting their sons or officials taxing their herds, some communities thrived on trade and herding. They carried salt wool and horses across the plateau, linking valleys that politics had torn apart. You watch their caravans stretch across the grasslands, yurts rising like pale mushrooms against the green, their lives simple but surprisingly resilient. Historians still argue whether this era of fragmentation should be seen as a true collapse or as a period of transformation. Was Tibet broken, its greatness lost, or was it reshaping itself, experimenting with new forms of power rooted in local communities and monasteries? You feel the tension in that question as you walk through a monastery courtyard where monks copy scriptures under the eyes of armed guards, holy men who are also political leaders, wielding prayer beads in one hand and authority in the other. You pass through one such monastery fortress. Its walls are thick, its gates barred, its towers armed with watchmen. Inside, novices chant softly, their voices blending with the low drone of conch shells. Yet in the audience hall, local rulers argue about alliances and raids, their words sharp, their tempers hotter than the butter lamps flickering beside them. The blending of sacred and secular grows stronger here, each monastery, both a school of wisdom and a center of power. Beyond the fortified halls, life goes on. Farmers still plant barley-spinning prayer wheels as they pass their fields. Shepherds guide yak across high pastures, chanting to keep their spirits company. At night, villagers gather around fires, listening to storytellers recount both Buddhist sutras and ancient tales of mountain spirits. The empire is gone, but the rhythm of life continues smaller, slower but steady. You wander into a valley where two clans contest the same grazing land. At dawn, men ride out with spears and bows, their banners snapping in the wind. Yet before the battle begins, they pause to consult oracles who cast dice or gaze into mirrors polished bright. The outcome seems decided as much by spirits as by steel. You feel the strangeness of this world where war and ritual interlace, each feeding the other. The plateau, once unified under a single ruler, now feels like a quilt of colors, patches, stitched awkwardly together, some fraying at the edges. To outsiders, Tibet seems diminished, no longer a great empire. But as you walk among its people, you realize it is not gone. It has simply shifted shape, its energy flowing into monasteries, villages, and nomadic tents rather than into one central throne. As night falls, you sit on a hillside overlooking scattered fires, one here, another far away, each belonging to a different clan or kingdom. They flicker against the vast darkness, unconnected, separate, yet still alive. The empire may be broken, but Tibet endures its spirit, wandering with the nomads, chanting with the monks whispering through the valleys. The stars shimmer coldly overhead as you wander beyond Tibet's valleys, tracing the echoes of its empire across the wider world. Though the banners have fallen and the throne is empty, Tibet's influence lingers, woven into the art trade and chronicles of neighbors who once feared or admired its power. You feel these echoes like ripples in a pond, faint yet enduring. A mainstream historical fact stands out: the Tibetan Empire at its height left marks on Central Asia, Nepal, Bhutan, and even China. Records in Tang chronicles still recall the capture of Chang'an in 763 CE, and inscriptions across Central Asia mention Tibet's role in trade and diplomacy. Though the empire collapsed, its memory endured in the documents of others, a reminder that the plateau had once stood as a peer among the great powers of Asia. You walk through Dunhuang in your imagination, where the great caves of Buddhist art stretch deep into the cliffs. On their walls, painted centuries ago, Tibetan patrons once commissioned images of Buddha's bodhisattvas and protective deities. Their inscriptions survive in Tibetan script side by side with Chinese and Sanskrit, a silent testimony that Tibet's presence reached this desert oasis. You run your hand across the stone, feeling the grooves of ancient letters carved with care. And here emerges a curious tidbit in Persian sources. Tibet was sometimes called Tubat, a land known for its horses and hardy soldiers. Arab chroniclers described it as a high kingdom where the air itself tested men's lungs. Though distant, the name Tibet carried weight across deserts and seas, a whisper of a land perched on the roof of the world. And you can almost hear traders in Baghdad's markets murmuring tales of warriors who lived closer to the sky than anyone else. Historians still argue how deep Tibet's cultural influence truly spread. Was it mostly military fleeting victories remembered in chronicles, or did its Buddhist revival ripple outward into art and ideas that crossed borders? Some scholars highlight the role of translators who brought Indian texts into Tibetan script, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost when India later faced invasions. Others argue Tibet's role was more local, its echoes fading quickly beyond its borders. As you drift among these debates, you sense both truths at once. Tibet was at once immense and fragile, a fire that blazed brightly but briefly yet warmed more than just itself. You move now through Bhutan and Ladakh, where memories of Tibetan kings linger in place, names, legends, and temples. Monks still chant in Tibetan, their voices rising into the night, their rituals echoing the empire's old rhythms. In Nepal, stories of Princess Brakuti remain alive, her marriage to Songtsen Gampo remembered as the seed of shared devotion. In distant monasteries in Mongolia and China, Tibetan texts continue to circulate, their words guiding generations who never saw the plateau itself. And in art, the echoes are brightest. The mandalas painted in Sami and later monasteries influenced styles across the Himalayas. The fierce, protective deities of Tibetan Buddhism find their way into Mongolian rituals, their faces grim yet compassionate, their flames blazing on temple walls. You step into one such shrine, the air thick with incense, your eyes drawn to a statue whose style clearly traces back to Tibet centuries earlier. Even without empire, the cultural pulse endures. As you wander further, you sense how Tibet's fall reshaped others' views. To some it became a cautionary tale, an empire that rose too high, too fast, only to collapse under its own weight. To others, it became a symbol of resilience, its culture surviving even when its politics failed. Either way, its name remained alive in chronicle scrolls and whispered tales across Asia. Night deepens, and you pause on the edge of the plateau. The wind cold, the stars countless. The empire is gone, but its echoes linger far beyond the mountains, rippling across deserts, rivers and seas. And as you listen, you realize those echoes are not faint, they are steady, woven into the fabric of history itself, impossible to erase. The night has grown long, and the winds of the plateau whistle softly in your ears as you take your final steps through this journey. You stand among the ruins of once mighty fortresses, stones scattered like bones across the valleys, prayer flags tattered and faded, their colors almost gone. The Tibetan Empire, which once roared across Asia, now lies silent. And yet in that silence you feel something profound, an echo that refuses to fade completely. A mainstream historical fact anchors this ending. By the 10th century, the unified Tibetan Empire had vanished, its power fragmented into regional kingdoms and monastic states. The name of the great Yarlung dynasty lived on in chronicles, but its throne no longer commanded armies or tribute. What remained were fragments, each carrying pieces of the legacy, but none able to restore the whole. You hear the absence in the hush of empty courtyards, in the quiet of abandoned watchtowers, where once soldiers sang to pass the cold nights. And yet in these ruins you find a curious tidbit whispered by villagers. Some say that hidden beneath certain fortresses lie sealed chambers filled with scrolls and treasures, buried when the empire fell, meant to be uncovered by future generations. Whether these caches truly exist or are only legends, the image lingers, a treasure waiting in the earth, a heartbeat beneath the stone. You crouch down, running your hand across the rocky ground, almost feeling the hum of memory beneath your palm. Historians still argue how the Tibetan Empire should be remembered. Was it a fleeting giant, overextended and destined to collapse, or was it a bold experiment in uniting the world's highest plateau into a power equal to China, India, and Persia? The truth is blurred like the horizon on a misty morning. What is certain is that Tibet's empire left traces that endure in culture, language, and faith, more lasting than armies or borders. You walk one last time through the valley of Yarlung, where the dynasty first rose. The fields still rustle with barley, the rivers still carve their paths, and villages still light butter lamps at dusk. Life continues small but steady as it always has. Above the mountains stand timeless, their snowcaps gleaming in the moonlight, indifferent to the rise and fall of kings. You pause, looking up at their silent majesty, and you realize the empire was always fleeting compared to the permanence of the land itself. The silence here is not emptiness, it is rest. The empire's story has ended, but its spirit lingers in the language written on scrolls, in the chants rising from monasteries, in the whispered tales of ancestors who rode with kings. The stones may crumble, but the echoes hum forever in the thin air of the plateau. And now, as your journey closes, you let the quiet settle in the weight of history, softening into calm. Let your breathing slow now, deep and steady, as we leave behind the echoes of the Tibetan Empire. The rise and fall of kings has passed the clash of banners and the murmur of monks, fading into the stillness of the mountains. Imagine yourself resting in a quiet valley, the stars stretched endlessly overhead, their silver light soft on the fields of barley swaying gently in the night breeze. The ruins around you are not frightening. They are peaceful stones lying in harmony with the earth, touched by moss, warmed by sun, cooled by wind. Close your eyes and listen. The wind brushes the grass. A river murmurs softly over rocks, and prayer flags rustle, faintly carrying blessings into the night air. You are safe here, held in the vast arms of the plateau. The empire's struggles no longer matter. The world has slowed to the steady rhythm of nature. The monks' chants, the soldiers' horns, the voices of kings, all have softened into whispers, blending with the breath of the mountains. Let each inhale draw in calm. Let each exhale release the weight of history. Feel the stillness sink into your body like cool stone, grounding you like soft earth, supporting you. The stars above shine steadily, patient and eternal, watching silently as they always have. You are small against this vastness, and that is comforting. You are part of the story, but you do not need to carry it. The land remembers, the mountains remember, and you can rest. So drift now, gently, like the prayer flags fluttering overhead like clouds sliding across the high sky. The journey is complete. The night is yours. Sleep well and let the echoes of history fade into dreams. Sweet dreams.